Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing the respiratory system and the structures of the respiratory system. But first let's just take a moment to talk about the function of the respiratory system. So we have oxygen and we're going to be breathing it in to the bottom of the lungs. And that's where we're going to be going through what we call gas exchange. The reason we need to do that is we need to get the oxygen that's in the air into the bloodstream. The bloodstream is going to carry the oxygen around the body to the tissues and to the cells, and the cells need oxygen to make ATP. Now remember, ATP is the cellular energy. So cells use this to do all of their daily functions. If there's no oxygen, they can't make ATP. If there's no ATP, they're going to die. So you will die also with no oxygen. Now, in the course of doing that, when we use oxygen to make ATP, we also create a waste product called carbon dioxide, or CO2. And then we have to carry that waste product back to the lungs and excrete it as waste. So the process of breathing in oxygen is called inspiration. And the process of breathing out CO2 is called expiration. Expiration. So inhaling is inspiration and exhaling is expiration. So let's talk about some structures that you'll see. This is a picture that you have in your respiratory ID folder. So you can go ahead and print this out and walk through it with me labeling things. Air is going to come in through the nares, which are the nostrils, into the nasal cavity, which is this area right here. The function of the nasal cavity is to do a couple of things. First, we're going to want to filter the air. We're also going to want to moisten the air, and we're going to want to warm the air. So those are the functions of the nasal cavity. If you think about winter here in Michigan, it gets very, very, very cold. And if you walked outside and took a big old deep breath of air through your mouth, it would actually hurt your lungs. It would sear your lungs because it's very dry and very cold. When you breathe through your nose, we have structures in there that slow the air down. We have mucus in there that moistens the air and helps to warm it up. And we also have hairs in there that help to filter out any particles that are in the air. This here is the oral cavity. That's your mouth. So we have the nasal cavity and we have the oral cavity. Behind or posterior to both of those areas is something called the pharynx. There are actually three areas to the pharynx. The nasopharynx is the area right behind the nasal cavity. The oropharynx is the area right behind the oral cavity. And the laryngopharynx is the area right behind the larynx. So the pharynx is actually a shared space between the respiratory system, where we're breathing air in and out, and the digestive system, where we're eating food. And that food and air share this pharynx space. Down towards the bottom of the pharynx, the two things being brought in by those two systems have to diverge. Anterior is an area called the larynx. This is also known as the voice box. This is the area that can vibrate and cause the sounds that we use when we're speaking. And this is the beginning of the windpipe. So this is no longer a shared space. You're not supposed to have food or any water or particles of anything getting into the larynx. In fact, if you do, something goes down the wrong pipe, they call it. It went down the larynx and it activated a bunch of irritant receptors in here, and they will respond by causing you to cough pretty violently and tear up and all that stuff. In the back of the larynx is the esophagus. And again, if you remember from the digestive chapter, the esophagus is where the food goes to go down through the diaphragm into the stomach. You can't see the esophagus on this drawing because it's behind the larynx and the trachea. Now, there are two very important structures that I wanted to point out. One is right here. This is called the uvula. The uvula is a little flap. If you look in the mirror at the back of your throat, you can actually see it hanging down in the mirror. It's a little flap that when you swallow, it's going to flip up and make sure that any food that's in your mouth or water or saliva that's in your mouth as you swallow is going to go down this way and not back up into the nasal cavity. The other structure is called the epiglottis. The epiglottis is made out of elastic connective tissue, and its job is to flip down and cover the larynx when we're swallowing. So again, we do not want food or drink to get down the windpipe because it'll end up down in the lungs. So the epiglottis, if you imagine this is the larynx here, it's just a hole, a channel where air is going to come in and out, and the larynx kind of sits on top of it. When you swallow, the larynx moves up slightly and the epiglottis folds down over the top. So it's completely sealed off. This means that the food can't get in there and it has to go down. It's forced to go down the esophagus, which is right posterior to the larynx. So again, the epiglottis closes off the larynx. The uvula closes off the nasal cavity. This area right here is the trachea. The trachea is the windpipe, and it is surrounded by C-shaped pieces of hyaline cartilage that are going to hold the windpipe open. Again, we want to maintain our airway. No oxygen, no ATP, no life. You don't want this to become crushed. The trachea splits into two main branches, and those are called the main bronchi or the primary bronchi. And those are going to split into several secondary bronchi and then into smaller and smaller tubes that we call bronchioles. And eventually, if the air keeps going, it's going to end up in little tiny sacs called alveoli. And the alveoli is where the magic happens. This is where gas exchange happens. We're going to talk about that again in just a minute. The last structure on this page I want you to recognize is right here. This is the diaphragm. And remember, we learned that the diaphragm was the separation between the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. But it's also very important in inspiration and expiration. The diaphragm, when it's relaxed, is domed up. Do you see how it's shaped, kind of curved here? So this is a relaxed diaphragm. It's not contracted right now. When it contracts, it's going to flatten out and be almost flat down here. So that would be a contracted diaphragm. And we're going to talk more about that in the next video when we talk about physiology of the respiratory system. But first, I want to show you a couple of closer pictures of the structures we've talked about. This is an actual picture, and this is a drawing of the opening to the larynx. So up here, this rounded part, that's actually the epiglottis. And remember, the epiglottis is the part that's going to flap down and it's going to cover the opening to the larynx. The opening to the larynx is this part right here. This is called the glottis. So the glottis is the opening to the larynx. On either side of the glottis, we have these cords, and these are actually called the vocal cords. These are the things that vibrate when you allow air to come past them under a certain amount of pressure. They make sounds. Outside of the vocal cords, we have the vocal folds. And these vocal cords move back and forth as the glottis opens and closes. So when you're just sitting there breathing, the glottis is open. You're not speaking, so the cords aren't moving back and forth. But if you went to swallow, the glottis would close, and then the epiglottis, remember epi means above, the epiglottis would come down on top of those vocal cords that are now pressed together. So we really have a two-layer system to close off the larynx. We really don't want to get any stuff in there. Okay, so alveoli. This is a really small picture, I apologize. Remember, when we're coming into the alveoli, we're coming in on a bronchiole, And oxygen's going to come in, and CO2 is going to move out. So that's the direction. Oxygen's going to be coming in here. It's going to be filling up these tiny, tiny little sacs with oxygen. And CO2 that's in here is going to be exhaled out. Remember, coming from the heart, we have blood that is going to go into the pulmonary trunk. From there, it's going to go into the pulmonary arteries, arterioles, and then capillaries. And we can see the capillaries right here. So here we go on a pulmonary arteriole, and here we are in a pulmonary capillary. And you can see that these capillaries literally cover the surface of the alveoli. And so gas exchange is going to happen right there. Once gas exchange has happened, we have to go back to the heart. We're going back on the left side of the heart. So the pulmonary capillaries are going to turn into pulmonary venules, and then back to the heart, where they will go into the left side of the heart and the blood will be pumped out into the entire body. Let's take a closer look at what these alveoli look like. I've already drawn one out here. So it's a little sac, and remember, we've got very, very, very thin tissue, 1 cell layer thick. We call this simple squamous epithelium. And remember, simple squamous epithelium is what makes up the alveoli, but it's also what makes up the capillaries. So this is alveoli, and this over here is the capillary. And blood is coming in from the heart, and it's deoxygenated blood. So let's draw some red blood cells. They're blue because they don't have any oxygen yet. Oxygen is coming into the alveoli, and it's going to leave the alveoli and go into the capillaries. This means that as the red blood cells pick up oxygen, they're going to become oxygenated. After they're oxygenated, they're going to go back to the heart, and then from the heart, they're going to be sent to the rest of the body. At the same time, we have something leaving the blood. That waste product that we talked about, CO2. And CO2 is going to be leaving the blood and leaving the alveoli on its way out to be expired out of the body as waste. So this is what happens in the lungs. Oxygen comes in, enters the capillaries, is picked up by the red blood cells. CO2 that's already in the blood leaves the blood, enters the alveoli, and is then exhaled out of the body. We call this external respiration. Why is it external? Well, it's external because this area right here is open to the outside of the body. So external respiration happens in the lungs. It's oxygen is going into the blood, and CO2 is going into the alveoli and then out of the body. Okay, so let's draw what happens at the other end. Okay, so here we are in a capillary. Blood is coming from the heart. It's oxygenated because it already picked up its oxygen, and we're entering the capillary bed. So let's draw the red blood cells here. And remember, we learned all about tissue exchange already. These guys have lots of oxygen. So what we're going to do is each red blood cell that's carrying oxygen is going to come to the tissues where there's not much oxygen at all. And so this oxygen is going to diffuse out and leave the capillary on the arterial side. Now, out here in the tissues, we have a bunch of cells. This whole time, they've been sucking up all the oxygen, and they've been producing CO2. So there's lots of CO2 in this environment. So what we're going to do is the CO2 is going to enter the bloodstream. Some of it's going to be picked up by the red blood cells, but most of it's actually going to travel in the blood. As the red blood cells lose their oxygen, they're not going to be so red anymore. They're going to go back to blue, and then this thing is going to turn into a venule. And it's going to continue back to the heart. This happens in the tissues. We call this internal respiration. Internal because no part of this, your blood vessels, your tissues, your organs, your cells, none of that is exposed to the outside. So internal respiration is when oxygen is entering the tissues and CO2 is entering the blood. It's then going to go back to the heart and lungs to be excreted out of the body. So we've got two different kinds of respiration here. We have external respiration where O2 comes in and enters the blood, CO2 leaves the blood and leaves the body, or internal respiration where O2 is going to leave the blood and CO2 is going to come back into the blood and be taken away from the tissues. Okay, that's it for today. Make sure you come back for the next video, which is respiratory physiology, and we're going to talk about how we get that air in and out of the lungs. See you in class.